I believe that whatever happened in Romania merits philosophical reflection. Of course, it's too early. We do not have the necessary distance. But still, something seemed to have happened there. It is called here a revolution. I think that's a wrong term, because revolution is a political category, and it doesn't look to me that what happened over there is political at all. Now, whatever happened there may, in the future, be interpreted as a turning point. It may be that what French and American philosophers are used to call post-history, post-histoire, has found its first, or almost first, expression in that small country of Broadway, if I may say so. Imagine for a moment, and this is why I accepted the invitation to come here to this meeting. Imagine for an instance that such a thing should happen, let's say, in the United States, or even in Western Europe. Imagine for an instance that television in the United States would take over. And I think you will have imagined the end of history, the end of what we are used to call history. Now, of course, it happened all the way in Romania, where nobody cares about. But imagine for a moment that it happens in what we are used to call the centers of decision, even in Moscow. I will submit to you the hypothesis that a new situation in the image culture is about to happen. But in order to sustain such an hypothesis, I will have to give you a few theoretical concepts. Please look at what I wrote on this blackboard. We have at least two possibilities to face our world. One is through image, and another is through linear writing. Originally, man was immersed in his circumstance. Now, when Homo sapiens sapiens came about, he made a step back from this circumstance, what Heidegger calls a Schritt zurück, and he tried to look at the circumstance from a subjective distance. And the result was an image. Now, the image transforms the world into a scene, like in a theater, scene, S-C-E-N-E. Through image, the world has a scenic character. It shows contexts, what Wittgenstein calls Sachverhalte, or what Heidegger calls Verhältnisse, Bezüge. The world seen through imagination is a context wherein things relate to each other. Now, this has a magical character. Every image is strongly magically loaded. When the first images were made, let's say at Lascaux, they were meant to orient people in the world. For instance, they were meant to show how to hunt oxen or ponies. And when people were exposed to these images, they probably danced. They made ritual happenings. And then they went out to hunt the animal. it is absolutely impossible to see the image outside magic. That is why I spoke yesterday in my brief intervention about voodoo. There is a voodoo character in every image. I told you that the image had a purpose to orient people from outside in the world in which they are thrown. An image is the possibility for me to step out from the world and see it from outside. So they are sorts of maps, but they are mediations, or as you say here, media, which is a barbarian way to use Latin. So they are mediations. They mean the world. But by meaning the world, they also hide it. This is an inner dialectics of every mediation. In German, for those who speak German, it becomes very clear. Bilder verstellen, was sie vorstellen. Sie stellen sich vor das, was sie vorstellen sollen. Now, this inner dialectics, which is responsible for the fact that images hide the world, is the reason for a very profound alienation. Images are meant for people to orient themselves in the world. But when they become very strong, people use their experience in the world to orient themselves in the image. The image becomes the concrete reality, and the world is only a pretext. Now, this inversion of the relationship between the world of experience and the world of imagination, this is called by the prophets idolatry. This is the reason why Plato wanted to prohibit art and images in the Republic. Images are anti-republican, anti-political. The purpose of image in this stage is to hide what happens. Now, when this idolatry, this curious sort of paganism, against which not only Jewish prophets, but also the pre-Socratian philosophers argued, when this became too dense, linear writing was invented. The purpose of linear writing was to open up the images by explaining them, and thus open up a vision of the experienced world. Now let me stress the difference between a scenic and a processual vision. In the scene, things happen. Everything is an happening. In the linear processual world, nothing happens. Everything is an event. The difference between a happening and an event is that a happening is the result of chance, of accident. It is an accident which becomes necessary. Those of you who know Monod, for instance, Le hasard et la nécessité, and those who know the reflections about chaos, which are now in fashion, will understand what I mean. The world of happening is a chaotic world, but everything repeats itself in that chaotic world. But in the event of history, in the vision of the world as a process, nothing ever repeats itself. Everything is an event which has causes and will have effects. And it is a world which can be rationally explained. To give you an example, for instance, the coronation of a king is a happening. It is the result of some accident. For instance, the old king dies. It happens all the time. Le roi est mort, vive le roi. And it is always something festive and magical. Now, the discussion of a law in Parliament is not a happening. It's an event. It has causes, and it will have effects, and it is done in order to have effects. The consciousness which corresponds to image is called the magical, mythical consciousness. And the consciousness which corresponds to linear writing, to this processual vision, is called political consciousness. Please understand what I am driving at. Television cannot be, like any other image, a political thing. It's anti-political by its very structure. And political consciousness is always directed against the image. Now, as you know, Western history begins with linear writing, for the simple fact that before the invention of linear writing, there was no history. There were no events. Everything only happened. And with the invention of linear writing, events were created. But of course, images didn't give up. As the linear writing advanced against images, in order to explain them away, the images infiltrated themselves into the texts, and they began to illustrate the texts. The dynamics of Western civilization, this inner tension within Western civilization, which renders it so explosive and so dangerous for other civilizations, is the fact that image and text, imagination and conceptual thinking, magic and politics are always in conflict with us. Now, during most of his Western history, this was a very creative process. Imagination became ever more conceptual, and conceptual thinking ever more imaginative. But with the invention of print, with Gutenberg, this changed. Images were eliminated from our culture. They were enclosed into glorified ghettos called museums or academies, and the situation was dominated by writing. The triumph of linear writing was Enlightenment, 18th century. And this is also the moment of the most developed political thinking. But as rational thought, political and scientific thought advanced, its message became ever less and less imaginable. You can see that with science. Science projects a vision of the world which is perfectly conceivable but totally unimaginable. So that in the 19th century, the world was becoming less and less imaginable. And this is the real reason why photography was invented. Let me say the following. The characteristic of linear writing, the political characteristic of linear writing before the invention of newspapers, is that you write in private and then you publish in the open space. And if you want to get at the message, you have to go in the open space, get at the text, and take it home in order to read it. Now, this dialectics between private creation and publication, this is the dialectics of politics. Politics is the distinction between a private space and a public space, an oike and an agora, a domus and a forum. Now, this pendulum motion, I go out from the private space into the public space in order to get that information. I take the information on the public space and take it home in order to elaborate on it and store it away. This is the dynamics of political consciousness. Hegel, as you know, used to call it the unhappy consciousness. Because he said, when I leave home to conquer the world, I lose myself. And when I go home in order to find myself again, I lose the world. And this pendulum is political consciousness. Political consciousness is always unhappy. There can be no political paradise, because political consciousness is an unhappy consciousness. Every consciousness is unhappy. If you want to be happy, it doesn't help you to have images. You have to become a worm. A worm, I think, an earthworm, I think, is happy. Now, if you take this into account, please consider what is happening to images. The images no longer publish. They are elaborated in a private place, and they go directly to the other private place. The sender is private, and the receiver is private. And the public spaces has become unnecessary, redundant. I think there is a party in Hungary which is called Forum. Let those people understand that the forum is no longer operative. There is no use for a forum any longer, because everything goes directly from the private place to the private place, where the public space, political space, used to lie. Now there are visible or invisible cables. Now I do not say that the same is not true of writing. Newspapers, for instance, are distributed to the private place. So even newspapers can be anti-political. Still, there is something in what is called the information revolution, and here the term revolution is correct, not in Romania, but in information. The information revolution, what the impact of information revolution is, that if you want to be informed, you have to stay home. If you go to the public space, you lose information. Now, let me go back to the photography. Now, photography was invented in order to render imaginable the events around us. Not only the political events, but also the scientific and technological events. And the situation was this. Look at the first of my beautiful drawings. History went on. The events advanced linearly, but photographs went one step up into transcendence. They transcended history, and they froze events into happenings. They took the events out of their context, they transcoded them into happenings, and then they went back to history. And they could be used as a sort of memory of history. Now this is called documentation. Images were used to document historical events. It wasn't so easy as I say, because the problem of subjectivity came into it. You know, photography was invented to give an objective image. But since the camera is coded, it is even less objective than is a painting. Still, the ideal was that there is history, and then there is a photographer, and he steps back from history into something which we might call mystical transcendence. And out of this mystical transcendence, he photographs what happens. You know, there is a problem. The moment you step back from politics into image, you can have no point of view. The political point of view is lost. Because the moment you get out from politics, you can see that every event has many possible points of view. None of it is correct. And what you can do is multiply points of views. You dance around the event. And the more you collect points of view, the better is your image. So that a photographer who dances around events, look at the people with the camera. There are dancers, they are Husserlian people. They try to be phenomenological. Of course, they don't succeed because, you know, image makers do not think. They cannot think. Thinking is anti-image. Now, they dance around it. And by dancing, by collecting points of view, they destroy ideology. which is the insistence on one point of view. If you hear political people speaking, they say, my point of view is the right one and yours is the wrong one. But if you listen to a photographer, he will say, every point of view is the same. The problem is how many points of view I can collect. But all these problems taken aside, the idea was that the image should document politics. But in the first half of the 20th century, and even stronger after the Second War, this relationship began to change. All of a sudden, politics was made in order to get into an image. The purpose of politics, which so far nobody knew the purpose of politics. Progress is not a purpose. Progress is a method. But where do we advance at? What do you mean we advance? We don't know where. All of a sudden we discovered where. We advanced toward an image. Everything wanted to be photographed and filmed and taken in a video. And the purpose of everything, like a wedding, the purpose of marrying was to be photographed at a wedding. The purpose of going on the moon was to be so that Mr. Nixon could appear on television and see how people walked on the moon. The purpose of the Arab hijackers of airplanes was to be taken on television. So all of a sudden, people discovered what politics is about. Politics is aimed at being taken, aufgenommen, in an image. And this created a curious phenomenon. Events began to accelerate. They rolled toward the image. One event followed another because every event wanted to be taken in an image. There were the people with the television cameras, and there were the photographers, and there were the people with the filmmakers, and they were standing there, and our history rolled toward them, and they said, please take me, please put me into the image. It's a curious, why should people do that? Now what happened in Romania? If I am right, another inversion happened. It's the image which now causes events. Now, what I'm saying is terribly frightening. I don't know whether you share my... I don't think that when we speak about post-history, we are aware of the terror we are speaking about. Imagine magic. We saw yesterday and this morning, I think all of us don't want to see the face of Mr. Ceausescu ever again in his life. So what we saw in the images yesterday and today was highly aesthetic. It was l'art pour l'art. It was the purpose of theater. I think it was Lessing who said, the purpose of theater is Mitleid und Furcht zu erwecken, to provoke sympathy and fright. So that happened. You ask whether those bodies are real or not, which we saw. Whether the water in Timisoara was really poisoned or not, that's a bad metaphysical question. The real experience is in the image. What happened behind the image is no use to ask. Political reasoning is no longer valid. There is no reality behind the image. All reality is in the image. What is now happening in Romania cannot be history, something else. Political reasoning does not apply to it. It is the result of magic. It's a sort of technical voodoo. How can we judge it? We do not have the criteria for it. We do not have a philosophy of post-history. We do not yet have a philosophy of an image in power.